I mean, you've been to Berlin. You know it better than I do in many ways. But since reunification, it seems to me that Berlin is just one big construction site, and it's a lovely city. There are lots of different sort of cultural sides to it. I mean, it's I don't know what kind of shape you'd call Berlin because it has 100 corners. But everywhere you go, there is construction going on everywhere.
That was really revealing when I came back after the wall had fallen down. My ex-husband and myself, we had written a Berlin book. I had done an American version and he had done the German version. So I knew Berlin pretty well. But the strange thing is I lost my way after the wall had fallen down because I was still going the way I was supposed to while the wall was still up. But coming back, I had seen so many cranes and construction sites. And as I hear you, they must have simply kept on constructing because I was flabbergasted when I saw what they were tearing up and tearing down.
Yeah, I mean, you must have seen clearly Potsdamer Platz. You must have seen where they built Hauptbahnhof near the Kanzleramt. As in, with my students at Deutsche Bahn, the sheer amount of work that went into recreating infrastructure and building this new, as it were, identity for Berlin was a huge effort, and it's not finished.
It won't ever finish. Have you ever read Berlin Alexanderplatz by Döblin?
No, I haven't. Please tell me about it.
Okay. Please do. It's the cacophony that you have now in its first form, and it seems orderly now from what it was then in the 20s.
Okay. Dublot, you say the name of the author?
Alfred Döblin.
Döblin.
He was one of the exiles, and it's the first novel on Berlin that really keeps you keep in mind because it paints a picture of Berlin. You feel it, you taste it, you smell it, you hear it, and the whole picture is coming at you when you read the book. There's also a film by the famous German filmmaker who died. What's the famous whose name I should know, and it will come in a while. He also made a film of it, and I think they're in the process of making another film of it, of the book.
Okay.
Berlin Alexanderplatz.
I see. Okay. Yeah, there are this series of books called Babylon Berlin, which they've also turned into a very successful TV series.
Yes.
There are so many coming out all about Berlin. There's a certain mysticism about Berlin. There is the continuous change, since the 20s is 1920s. Now it's 100 years later. I keep forgetting. Since the 1920s. This continuous change, this social upheaval, this political revolution, then the years of obviously destruction on the one hand of society through the Nazis, then thereafter the bombing, then the rebuilding and the recreating, and it's fascinating. And I don't know many cities, if there are any other, that have quite had the same history as Berlin.
I'm sure that there are similar cities with just as many upheavals and experiences, bad and good and indifferent. But of course, Berlin is close to our hearts, and we feel it. We feel what is going on in Berlin. We don't feel what is going on in Paris because we're removed from it. and from the outside you really can't feel it. I'm still close enough through also the. I think I've read 100 books on Berlin for our book. I'm still close enough even to modern Berlin, because we had a International Pen Conference in Berlin in 2006, and I was on the planning committee, so I was in and out of Berlin all the time. So I saw the development until about 2006, 2007, and I can still hear and feel the vibrations of what is going on in Berlin.
Yeah, and it's it's a story which continues to develop, and of course, at the moment in the Kanzleramt, obviously Mrs. Merkel has sort of reigned supreme for the last 16 years, and then as of September, there's going to be a new, shall we say, temporary custodian, and we shall wait with anticipation to see who that will be. But before we reach that, we ourselves have the story that is Pen International before us. So when we sort of came to a conclusion of the previous session, you had told us about how your work in Pen Germany had begun, and we ended it in a way which would lead us naturally towards Pen International, which will also include, I guess, this conference in Berlin that you were part of the planning committee for in 2006, which coincided with the German World Cup, which was also a huge success.
Yes. Yes, I wanted to go back to my beginnings as president of International Pen Writers and Prison Committees, because that recaps again what International Pen is doing and what its committees all around the world are doing. Everybody who works for international or national pen centers, who is not employed as in the offices, is doing volunteer work. So all of that work that really pulls together in the end is free and volunteer and with your brain and your heart. I always said I take whatever happens to my colleagues personally, but I do what I can professionally to alleviate it. International Pen has one main goal, and to me that was very important, not to endanger the reputation or the lives of the people we stepped out to help. And that was sometimes not very easy, because you deal with opponents, you deal with all kinds of people and all kinds of organizations who do not really think in terms of protecting the charges that they have. I'd already talked about the rapid actions. Those were the main means of getting to the public. These were letters of protest, letters of appeal to governments, to legal departments, to embassies, to anybody who would listen, anybody who would help, and anybody who would spread the information on the writers these rapid actions were talking about. In very few instances were we able to really contact the families of our charges, of those who were pressured and were threatened with death or with imprisonment. But of course, whenever we did, we tried to help not just psychologically to tell them that we were behind and were working for their family member, but also to see whether we could, through some bit of money, help them make life easier for them. We had constant conferences. We had a huge Writers in Prison conference every 2 years. One was in Istanbul, one of the most important, to me, the most important ones. One in Glasgow. In Istanbul, of course, we were right in the middle of a country where things were happening to our friends and who were threatened with torture, with prison, with campaigns against them, with physical assaults. And we had talked about the fate of Hrant Dink, and Orhan Pamuk was in front of the courts as well. PEN individual centers around the world were able to adopt writers who were under pressure and in danger, adopt them as honorary members, so that that particular PEN center or those particular PEN centers would get together and try anything they could to help those people. And sometimes, because it was a joint venture, it was more effective than individual centers doing individual things. The setup in London was that we had as I mentioned her a couple of times, wonderful director of the International PEN Writers in Prison Committee. We had fantastic researchers. If you think that 4 or 5 people do the research around the world for maybe 200 active cases every year, it's fascinating to see how they do it and with what verve and love they continue to do their research, which then is spread to the individual PEN centers. The other work is campaigns for individual people beyond the protests, and we had international campaigns and special invitations during congresses or international Writers in Prison conferences to people we had tried to help and who had gotten out of prison. So we had direct contact to many of those who had been in prison and who aligned themselves with our work for the rest of their existence, I should think. That happened in Mexico with Galeano. This happened in Turkey with a number of people. So we were constantly on the way to someplace to get together. We knew one another. We trusted one another. During those Writers in Prison conferences, every 2 years, there were maybe 100, 120 people who had worked for Writers in Prison, and we exchanged ideas, and we taught each other what they didn't know. They taught us what we didn't know. We heard how they went about it, where they got the money to do what they needed to do. It was very, very helpful to have these conferences. Plus, we were seeing each other once a year internationally during the PEN International Congresses, which were held in different countries and different towns every year. So there was a very close link between those who were working for writers in prison and for International PEN in general. So it was a family affair in a way, but it was very serious and very professional, I must say. So in cases where we had special topics to campaign for, this was one of the topics was impunity, which of course was very heavy in Mexico. Nobody was brought to justice who had killed somebody. The government didn't have the power to go against the drug barons and so on and so forth. So impunity became a very big problem worldwide, not just in Mexico, but wherever. There was campaigns about libel and slander. And this again brings us back to Turkey, because they had in their penal code, I think 5 or 6 laws against libel. You could libel the flag, you could libel the memory of the founder of
Atatürk.
Turkey, Atatürk. You could slander the present president, whatever. You could be brought to court on slandering anybody and everything. And this became very dangerous, because that was one of the main accusations against writers. When they were writing the truth, campaigning against corruption and so on, this was always turned into a trial for slander or libel. And those were, of course, then the thematic campaigns that we did. And on top of that, we always had quite a number of, where possible, we had quite a number of observers at trials, particularly in Turkey. Of course, you couldn't get an observer into China or into Vietnam or into African countries. So the big example is Turkey. We had major observers in almost every one of the trials, and in Russia as well. We had one Russian member of PEN who traveled the country if there was somebody in front of the courts. That was another major effort in showing the world that we were there and we were watching.
Can I ask why it was possible that PEN could have representation in Turkey and I guess Russia, but not in Africa and not in China? Is there a reason? Was it a funding issue, or was it a politically exclusive issue?
It was an exclusive issue. No Chinese court would let a foreign observer into the country, let alone into the courtroom. And we were in the courtrooms. Africa was another problem. The court action in Africa is not as vocal and not as visible as the court action in other countries. Plus, that would have really, really been hard on anybody's purse to fly to Africa and observe every court trial there. I remember most importantly, it was Russia and Turkey. And we have still one of our friends, my predecessor as Writers in Prison Committee chair of International PEN. He lives in Turkey and he observes everything that is going on, and he's very close to the activists in Turkey. Knows them all, he's friends with all, and we get the clearest information through him from Turkey, and the link between Sarah Wyatt, who was our specialist on Turkey from the Writers in Prison Committee, and my predecessor, the link is still existing. So there's still most direct information on the Turkish side in London.
It's it is fascinating because, I mean, you're talking about conditions which existed at the beginning of the 21st century, but also in your previous sort of discussions and arguments, you've mentioned that issues within Turkey with regards to the freedom of the press and various other freedoms in Turkey have been problems for many, many, many years. And we see the same thing repeating itself today with Erdogan, who continues to exhibit these nationalistic right-wing fanaticism, which in some ways hides the fact that he is also, and his friends and his family are benefiting financially. But he hides all of that with everything else that he does. And still he personally benefits from the position that he holds. And yet he considers everybody else who is against him to be an enemy of the state.
We have to remember that there once was an Ottoman Empire. And where there was an empire, there were leaders or pashas or sultans or whatever who went out into the world and fought against other countries and conquered other countries. And it took a long while for the Ottoman Empire to be held to task. The modern Turkey started with Kemal Atatürk, which was a new start, but at the same time, it also generated what we see in England sometimes, that when you lose an empire, you become very, very defensive of your former status. And the division in Turkey is between the military, the traditionalists, those who would like Kemal Atatürk back again, he had a secular Turkey in mind. The modern leader or would-be pasha has an Islamic Turkey in mind. So you have the religious, you have the political, and you have the historical aspects that play together, and that makes it very difficult to predict what will happen in Turkey.
Yeah, I mean, we can come back to the Turkish issue a bit later because, tomorrow is the 24th of April, which for Armenians is a significant date. So we can come back to that a bit later. But so getting back to your work within International PEN, there's a lot of, how can I say it? There is a lot of background paperwork, a lot of documentation, a lot of research that goes on to be able to do what you do, it seems to me. It's not simply a romantic adventure, is it? Or sort of jumping out into the world and saving people.
Of course not. While I was vice president in charge of Writers in Prison for German PEN, there was a lot of paperwork because I was giving talks about the state of writers in prison at least 6 times a year. The 2 book fairs in Leipzig and Frankfurt, we always had a report, and this was presented to the press. The day of the persecuted writer on the 14th of November, and the Kesten Medal ceremony was an occasion for me to give another report for the International Pen Congress, and for the National Pen Congress was another occasion to sit down and write a 6-7 page researched report on what the situation was. Every letter with regard to German Pen, of course, I had to write myself. And when I became international chair, I had an office in London and wonderful people who did a lot of work, particularly in terms of the documentation and the letter writing and so on and so forth. They prepared the conferences. I only chaired the conferences. I chaired the international conference. I chaired the International Writers in Prison conferences. I was there at their disposal, so I was in London, in and out of London all the time. But that bound us together as well. I knew them very well. I knew every move that was going on in London, and they knew me. So there was total trust, and I knew if they asked me to sign a letter, of course I signed. There was no question. So it was less day-to-day work, but at the same time, of course I had to stay on top of international developments, because I couldn't stand there and say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't know anything about Myanmar, or I don't know anything about Turkey, or I know nothing about Mexico or Peru or whatever. So I had to stay in touch with what was going on in the world. And that, of course, in a way, stayed with me to some degree till today. But at the end of 2009, I decided I have to stop getting involved everywhere. So I was at the point where I was having regular heart trouble, and I had promised myself at 70 I'm going to stop. So as I said, I'm still very, very interested in what is going on in the world, but I'm not as informed as I was then. And I was informed because I informed myself, and I was informed because I was being informed by my friends in London.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that, because, I mean, it requires a serious level of fortitude to be able to look into the very dark soul that is humanity, and try to find sense in some of the things that occur. I mean, I remember when I was sort of do some reading for, a project that I was working on personally, I delved very deeply into the excesses of government. And after about 3 days of just intensive research, I felt numb almost. My head was almost exploding from the amount of the depravity sometimes of some of the decisions that were taken by governments, governments that considered themselves to be, democracies, pillars of democracy. With the one hand, and on the other hand, the crimes and atrocities that were committed in the name of freedom were mind-numbingly difficult to accept. So I had to take a break. And I mean, for you to be able to be so involved at the same time and continue the way that you did for such a long time was almost heroic, I imagine.
No. I had the benefit and the privilege of being part of a committee the International Committee, meaning Center in London, and the 100 pen centers with writers in prison committees around the world, we worked together. We supported one another. We went through the same thing at the same time. And of course, you can't stop thinking about the depravity, the violence, the injustice, but we were trying to help individual people. And there were so many instances where, in a very, very small way, we could help. As I said, together with other organizations, or very, very rarely only in pen, that made up for everything. Whenever there's a bit of positive outcome, the negative didn't stay with me. I had registered it. It became an analytical knowledge, but it didn't stay an emotional knowledge. So in a way, I was also very, very fortunate that at the same time I was working first on the board and later on the council of the Heinrich Böll House, because there we were in constant touch with people who were hunted, who had been tortured, who were afraid of death, who didn't know where to go. And those personal meetings with somebody from Syria, for instance, who had been in prison for 14 years. And he came on a scholarship to the Heinrich Böll House. And we met. I knew what he had been through. He came with his girlfriend, and the three of us sat down and we had a coffee and something to eat before I dropped them at the Böll House. All of a sudden it was, I'm meeting my brother and my sister. It becomes that personal, because you get to know people who have suffered, who have withstood, who are trustworthy, and who were not destroyed. Of course, we had a lot of people who were destroyed. There we could only help with the help of others. But the meetings with our friends who came into scholarships, not just at the Böll House, but also later we might talk about Writers in Exile. We had a system in German pen later where we had 6 cities of refuge in Germany, and I was in charge of the place here in Cologne. So I got to meet and work for whoever got the scholarship for Cologne. And these meetings make it very, very clear that you're doing the right thing. You're doing the right thing. Whatever the others do in the background, the politicians, the torturers, the guards in Evin prison in Tehran, you can withstand. You are helping to withstand, and they help those who have been there, help you to withstand and to really deal with the emotions, but keep them under control. As I said, I took these things personally, but I had to deal with them professionally. To deal with them personally, on a personal level, on an emotional level, within myself, I mean. Of course, I dealt with them when I met them on an emotional level as well. But to deal with them inside my own being on the emotional level would have killed me.
Yeah. I'm currently working with an organization with regards to their workshops. We're doing workshops on anti-discrimination. And what I take from your words here is to essentially, focus on the positives of the successes and do not allow the sea of hate that exists around us to sort of pull us down. Because the small successes that organizations experience are like the sort of the timbers of a ship that help you to survive in the ocean.
Yeah, hate and violence take away your strength. If you keep those as your only perspective, they not just kill you, but they strain you. They take all the energy that you have or might have on the positive side away from you. And I don't know, I must have done the right thing at one point. From the beginning, I was able to not separate emotion from intellect, but to deal with it without suffering myself.
Yeah, I can only applaud because even again before when I mentioned I complimented your work, you refused to accept compliments of a certain nature, and you delegate such compliments to the people who really suffered, and you pass on appreciation of a very warm nature to the people who worked with you. And I only hope, Karin, that in many pages of your writings that you have recorded your suggestions for management techniques, because people who are considering management positions would do very well to learn from the way in which you have approached your responsibilities.
As far as management was concerned, Sarah Wyatt taught me. She had courses in management, and she was doing, as I said, wonderful. I've never met anybody who was that professional in her job, and I started very early to copy the way she did it. But our involvement was different during the time I was working for International Pen, because she was there responsible for everything in the London office, and I was on the outside coming in, pumping her for information. She had a lot of preparations done when I came. I had my Congress folders presented to me before I got into the first meeting. I didn't have to do that. She did that. So that was management. I wasn't managing. I was trying to be rational about how do I go about it. I didn't just jump in, because jumping in to anything is a risk. If you jump into something, look around right away and make clear where you are. And probably I jumped in and I looked around and I found a lot of things I could learn from.
Yeah. I mean, there are lots of, I don't want to completely take away from the conversation of International Pen. And to be honest, I'm more than happy to come back on many occasions and, continue the conversation about the International Pen. But as we talk, you say such, crucial things, which always bring to mind different elements. And I do like to connect our discussions with what we are experiencing in the present day. A number of organizations over the last few years, which are organizations engaged in alleviating human pain, human rights organizations, in many cases, perhaps even rescue organizations, have suffered from abuse of their own where representatives in other areas which don't necessarily receive so much media attention have engaged in activities which one would only consider to be discriminatory in nature. There have also been accusations internally of discrimination. How were things at PEN? So, I mean, it's an international organization. You're on the front line in many ways. How was it there? Was there anything like that?
We couldn't help everybody. With that small staff, we had to go where the punches were. We couldn't wait for somebody who was maybe more deserving. We helped where we could help. And the only caveat was they were not supposed to have advocated violence or been involved in violence. And apart from that, there was no party, there was no background, that no charge that kept us from helping. The whole community of PEN would not deal with anybody who had anything to do with violence.
And what about
in the charter?
Okay, but what about within your own ranks? Did people, did you have your own scandals? Were you able to eradicate such behavior quickly? Because other organizations, perhaps because they're larger, perhaps because they operate in areas which are not so prevalent, find it difficult to do that.
We were not a station. We were not a hierarchical organization in that sense. The Writers in Prison Committee did what the Writers in Prison Committee needed and wanted to do. We didn't have anything to do, and we turned sideways sometimes when there were problems in other departments or in other committees or whatever, to keep our mind and our effort and our strength in the work that we wanted to do and needed to do, what we had been voted in for. Of course, there were personality clashes. They were in every center. They were in the International PEN as well. Some international presidents were closer to our heart than others. But that's life. You have to deal with it.
Sure, absolutely. How do you see the current work of PEN progressing? Because it seems that there is as much work to do now as perhaps there ever was during the Cold War and in the years since.
We have a very, very good and very active president, a woman president. She is also on the board of International PEN. And that combination of PEN president in a local center and involvement in International PEN, to me, is actually what should be required from everybody who is working for PEN, because you get both sides and you can get involved in a lot more things, and from a different perspective than just sitting in, let's say, in Holland and go to Dutch gatherings of writers. The Dutch are better than the Germans in that sense. They are more open because they're a smaller country, which is an aside. The provinciality of some PEN centers depends on the provinciality of the countries that they live in. And in many ways, the involvement in International PEN was really, it was easier for me and less work then working for German Pen, which was a 80, 90-hour job in not just in the beginning, but throughout. And of course, nobody knew it because I had my corner and they saw my reports, and I wasn't involved in the rest of Penn, which made it difficult later when the board or some people on the board wanted to be part of or tell me how to run Writers in Prison. And what they sometimes did was they ran with my report and presented it as their own. I swallowed it. As long as it got into the press, I didn't care. I did not care. I wasn't in there for myself. It's not Karin who was important. It was the work that was important. And that was the guideline I never crossed.
Yeah, your selflessness, I think.
It's not selflessness. It's sanity. It's sanity.
Yeah, you say it as sanity, but it is still. I would beg to differ with complete respect. That you do approach these things with a certain degree of selflessness. Now, that's because of your sincerity in the tasks that you do. But there is no reason on this planet why somebody from a similar organization should take credit for your work, if indeed no degree of selflessness was involved. But
it still got to where it was supposed to go. It got in the ears of the press.
Yeah.
Whether I do it or whether somebody else does it, this is the way we worked. Most of us worked because we knew that the only way we could help was to get it into the press. And German press, for instance, was very, very cagey sometimes and didn't bring very much about Penn. Amnesty had much more of a presence in the German public mind, and still has. But lately, the reputation of Penn has increased here in Germany too. So, of that, I'm very, very happy.
Yeah, I wish there were more people who approach these kinds of topics who are similar to you in their approach. I know you wanted to talk a bit more about writers in prison and the committee there. May I kindly request that we do so next week, because we are approaching that 1 hour point, and I wanted to introduce the element of the Armenian genocide, which a lot of my friends and relatives around the world are really hoping that President Biden finally does what a US president had always promised but never delivered upon, and that is to recognize the events which began on April 24th, 1915 as genocide. And I mean, many people probably wouldn't know why it's April 24th that is commemorated. And this is quite interesting from the perspective of what Penn represents. It's because the Ottoman government in 1915 decided to kill or hang 300, I should say, Armenian writers, poets, thinkers, and essentially community leaders, because they thought that by doing this, they would remove the head of Armenian culture, and thereby the strength of what it meant to be an Armenian. And in itself, this serves to prove yet again the great importance of the writer, the mind, the thoughts, the pen, as it were.
That's why writers are in danger, and they are those who open their mouth are the first in danger when there's a dictator on top.
Yeah, absolutely.
And as far as the Armenian question is concerned, within German exile, one of the more famous writers who later lived in Italy was Armin T. Wegener, who is very, very beloved by a lot of Armenians because he stood up. He was the one who wrote a letter to Wilson, President Wilson in America, referring to the Armenian genocide. So we in German Exile, I'm still a member of German Exile Pen. I'm in both pens now. So anybody who was in our pen at the same time, of course, is very close to our heart. And this is why I know a bit about the whole process, the whole genocide, the surroundings. We are talking about right after the Second World War, and the European forces were just realigning, and in that sense, the Armenian question got sidetracked.
Yeah.
Till today, to some degree, but we'll talk about that later.
Yeah. We shall do so indeed. Karin, what can I say? I started today with a workshop about anti-discrimination, and I felt this. Whenever I talk about these kinds of topics, I feel a deep connection with the people with whom I communicate, because when you have people who are genuinely like-minded and they want to do good. And sometimes the questions arise, how can we make a change? I feel on occasion a little bit despondent because I wish I had the power to provide immediate change. And that will never happen, will it?
It will never happen.
No.
Every change is slow. And to me, the Sisyphus myth is very close to my heart, and not just to my heart, also to my mind. We have to stem against whatever comes. It will try to overrule us, but we shouldn't let up and in fighting. And this is still my philosophy. And the changes will be very slow, and they will roll back. We will have rollbacks over and over again. Look at history. Look at the changes in history. Some changes were very fast, particularly if an empire fell. That was very quick, usually. The building of an empire was relatively slow. That's politics on the larger level. Politics on the smaller level is the community. What happens in a community if the politics go wrong? Where are the voices? And the voices to this day are the journalists and writers. And this is why they are under barrage or wherever they go. And this is why I think it's so important that we have the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom to publish, to right to stand up and say our mind. And this is what I had been working for. That was the only reason I was in that whole fight. And I still am, in a way, wherever I can.
Yeah, Karin, you'll have to forgive me for considering you an inspiration, and I know you will deflect the compliment, and yet you remain to be, no matter how much you deflect it, and that's just a fact, and you can't erase it, especially as I'm in charge of the editing. So I will.
Okay, I won't say anything.
Thank you. Thank you. But yeah, I am. Yeah, afterwards we'll arrange when to come back and continue the talks that we have begun. All I can say is thank you. It's a pleasure as always, and your input and insight is always fascinating and illuminating.
And I never know what comes out in terms of questions on your side or comments on your side. So
Sorry.
I'm no. This is why I'm relatively spontaneous. It's not that I've been preparing for our talks recently, but just a few dates I put down. But I find it fascinating to have this level of conversation with two people from different angles approaching the same subject and in a way saying the same thing in different ways. And for that, I'm very thankful.
It's a pleasure. And yeah, long may it continue is all I have to say.
Okay.
Yeah. Karin, thank you. And yeah, I wish you a wonderful weekend.
Thank you. You too. And give my love to your family.